Veronica Skotnes does not lead a traditional life. Like the rest of us, COVID impacted us all in a monumental way. And for her, she decided to forego the common luxuries we're all accustomed to and live her life at sea on a 42-foot boat in Finnmark, Norway, within the Arctic Circle. While doing routine work as a skipper on various ships in the area, she kept noticing the incessant waves of trash that would wash ashore. She decided to do something about it. She now helps various nonprofits with ocean conservation efforts that seek to remove trash from the ocean and recycle wherever possible. This is her story.
You were speaking of this concept of overwintering. Now, myself included, and I'm sure a lot of my listeners, they probably don't know a lot of sailing terms. So do you want to just explain like some of the problems you've had in the last couple of days in terms of what overwintering is? And I know you had some issue where someone kicked you out of the harbor and you're trying to find a place to be more permanent for the winter. So what's that like?
Yeah, so essentially, because I live in the Arctic, so the winter here can get a little bit harsh. We have around 40 days of no sunlight at all, and temperatures easily reach like minus 40 degrees Celsius. I'm not sure. I think it's also minus 40 in Fahrenheit. So yeah, like that kind of describes a typical Arctic winter up here. So it's very important for us to, or for me to find a harbor or port where I can feel like the boat is safe, just in case you also get stuck somewhere, if that makes sense. Because obviously in a hurricane in minus 40 degree weather, you can't really move the boat. So you need to make sure that the boat is safely in port at the time when like the storms start hitting and the hurricanes start hitting and like the winter really sets in. So for me that means finding a port, but it's also not that many settlements around here. So you're kind of limited in the amount of villages and ports that are also good. And there are not so many sailboats. It's a lot of fishing vessels. So most harbors are made for fishing vessels or with fishing vessels in mind, which means they're usually not as deep because sailboats have this deep keel. It means that it goes quite far down into the ocean, whereas fishing vessels are usually more shallow built. So it's always a little bit of a challenge, but I think I finally found a harbor.
Awesome. Now, is that the kind of thing where you just show up to a dock and you can kind of use anyone's dock, or do you have to like, is there, in the US, everything's like super formulaic. So you have to go through like a registration process and pay a fee and all this kind of stuff. So in where you are, is everyone pretty friendly about it, or is it, how does that work?
Yeah, it's very informal. So normally maybe you will find some contacts, so you will like ask around, and if you can't go into this harbor, then they for sure know someone else on like another island or somewhere. The area of Finnmark is at the same size as Denmark in area. I'm trying to think of a U.S. American state that I could kind of compare, but I'm not sure. But we are only 70,000 people in this area, so you can imagine it's a very vast area that is unpopulated as well, and people know each other. Like everyone has connections somewhere. So usually you would just maybe call someone beforehand, or you just show up and you ask and you kind of hope for the best. But again, the distances are very long. So if you make the travel to like one harbor, you kind of want to make sure that there's space there, especially if there's like an incoming hurricane or something. So usually if I'm sailing solo, if I don't have to, I will prefer to go during daytime, or at least when it's light. Of course, in the summer, because we're in the Arctic Circle, we have midnight sun. So we have 24 hours of daylight all summer. So that's great. So in the summer, you don't really have to consider it. But in the winter, I try to at least go when it's light, just because it's a bit nicer and you can see, But it's not really a problem to go during night as well, because there's not a lot of traffic. It's not like a busy port or anything like you will have in bigger cities.
Okay, sweet. So then let's go back to the beginning. Very basic. Are you originally from Finnmark? Or was this something that as you've been sailing, you kind of like this area and have gravitated to. So kind of where'd you grow up, and like what was the inspiration to buy a sailboat in the first place?
Yeah, so I'm originally from Norway, but I grew up a little bit further south on a piece of coast that's called Sunnmøre. So it's not within the Arctic Circle, but it's still on the coast. And I always grew up with boats, and my family is like a fisherman family. So I had very strong connections to the ocean. And then at some point, I just found like this fascination for the Arctic, and I started studying a program that was called Arctic Nature Guiding, which is essentially like outdoor recreation in the Arctic. In Norway, we have a concept called friluftsliv, which is a very culturally important concept for Norwegians, which is essentially just the philosophy of being outdoors in nature and with nature. And I was really interested in this, so I did a 3-year bachelor program in friluftsliv in the Arctic, and yeah, essentially recreation in the Arctic. And that kind of made me move a bit further north. And then I also did 1 year on Svalbard, which is an island group. It's kind of in between mainland Norway and the North Pole, but it belongs to the Kingdom of Norway. So I did a program there, and I became like very fascinated with living in the Arctic. And then at the time, I was working within tourism when Corona came. I don't know if you know this pandemic that we had. Yeah. So Svalbard, where I was working with tourism, I got very, how do you say, like hit by Corona, like very much affected because of the tourism and travel restrictions, and they basically shut down the whole island because it's such a fragile infrastructure there. There's no hospital or anything, so they just decided to shut everything down. And of course, everyone went bankrupt, and everyone had to leave almost that were working within tourism. So for me, I lost my job and my apartment during this, and I felt like it was just the best time to be like, okay, what should I do? And I've always wanted to buy a boat, so I figured like, okay, this is my shot. Actually, this is the best chance I get.
Nice. So is the boat that you have, is that something that like you got it from like a I don't really know how it works. Like I don't know what the Norwegian equivalent of Craigslist is, but like you go on like some website and like people are just selling their boats, or did you like, is it a family heirloom or something like that, or how'd you find the boat, and how'd you know it's the right boat, I guess?
Yeah, essentially it was a Craigslist thing with the Norwegian equivalent. But yeah, I bought it secondhand. It's called an Anse 42, which was a Norwegian-built boat maker in the 80s. So it's actually over 40 years old, or 40 years old this year in 2022. So yeah, I bought it used, of course. And I don't know, I think it was like a gut feeling thing. I bought it unseen, which you are not supposed to do. But I had a friend like go and check it out because it was in Oslo and I was on Svalbard at the time. So I had a friend like go check it out, and he said, "Yeah, like this looks very good." And I don't know, I just had like a gut feeling that it was the right boat, and I really think so. Like I'm still very happy with it. I don't know if it was just like terrible luck or or what it was, but yeah.
Not too much maintenance, I hope.
Of course, there's a little bit. It's still a 40-year-old vessel, so there's always quite a lot to do. And it is quite big, like it's 42 feet. So for just me, it's quite a lot to handle. I think if someone were to consider buying a boat and selling solo, I would maybe recommend opting for a smaller boat. Just depending on how much maintenance you want to do, it's a saying that like bigger boat, bigger problems, and bigger money. So that's, yeah, take what you want.
So my understanding from based off of what I've read about you and your journal entries, as you were sailing around during this time, you realized that there was a lot of trash, right? So how did the whole marine waste effort come to be, and how is that related from when you were sailing during this time that you're?
Yeah, essentially, it's a bit like what you said. I was starting to sail the Norwegian coast. I bought the boat in Oslo, and I wanted to sail it to northern Norway, to the Arctic. And it was a 3-month journey from Oslo to the north of Norway. It's a long country, but I also wanted to have a lot of time and like not rush it. It's a very beautiful coastline. And at the time, I was visiting small islands, really small places where there were no humans at all. It was so far off. You could only get there by boat, and there was no like infrastructure, no buildings, nothing. It was just like wild nature. And I saw so much plastic and it struck me that like these places that have absolutely no contact with humans are still so affected by humans in terms of marine waste. So I started like picking up trash as I went, but it was of course like way too much for me to handle with just a boat and like maybe a few bin bags, and I could pick maybe 10 bags in a day. And but there would be so much left. So by the time I started kind of posting on Instagram, because I was really frustrated by what I was seeing, and I was like picking, and I was like, it's not working, I'm not doing anything, I'm just picking and picking, and then to the next island I go and there's 10 tons more. So I was getting really frustrated and posting a lot online. And by the time I reached the Arctic Circle, this organization called In the Same Boat, they had contacted me. They are a Norwegian NGO that works 100% with marine waste and cleaning marine waste. So they contacted me and they said, like, I think maybe you should come and work for us. So, and that was kind of it. I went down there. They have their main base in Nordland, which is kind of in the middle of Norway in a way. So I went down there and I had a talk with them, and it seemed like we had, the same interests when it came to picking marine waste from an idealistic standpoint and not necessarily an economical standpoint, to earn money or anything. So yeah, that looked very good. And then I was actually given my own team and my own project. They wanted to start up in Finnmark, at the very north of Norway. And they basically just gave me all, like, here you go, start up a team, have fun. So I got all boats and everything, and I started my own team up there with help from In the Same Boat, of course.
That's incredible. And I believe in your first year, you collected something like 50,000 kilograms of trash. Do I have that right?
Yeah, correct.
That's amazing. And now another thing worth mentioning is I believe, and I'm hoping you could explain this a little bit better than I can, because I have a very cursory understanding of it. But a big reason why some of the trash is in these remote places in the Arctic Circle is because of the Gulf Stream, right? So it kind of loops through the Atlantic, and I don't know how it works on the Pacific Ocean. I can only say for the Atlantic, but it kind of loops through, and that's how it kind of scoops all the trash from the more populated places, such as the U.S. and London and everywhere else, right?
Yeah, so essentially both the Gulf Stream and the North Atlantic Drift, they both head towards the Arctic. So, but especially the Gulf Stream, it comes from, the US, and it kind of goes around, and then it hits Norway, and it follows the Norwegian coast up and into the Arctic, and then it kind of does a loop and it goes down again. And that is partially the reason why we have so much trash in the Arctic, because there are not so many humans, so there's not so many people who are here to throw plastic in the ocean. So a lot of what we find is from the US and from continental Europe. We often find packages that has like US logos and writing, but also from mainland Europe, especially from the UK. And from Russia, we find a lot because we're quite close to the Russian border. And but I would say 90% of what we find is from the fishing industry. So from fishing and fish farming and also the oil sector. That is like the majority, especially in terms of weight, because it's often heavy industrial. I don't know in terms of like singular pieces, it's a difference between finding like one plastic bag and one like 400 kilo net. They're kind of considered one piece, both of them. So I don't know in terms of pieces, but in terms of weight, it's definitely the fishing industry that is mostly responsible for the plastic in the Arctic.
So I was really fascinated when I saw that something you do on your day-to-day is this trash database. So could you tell us a little bit about what that's all about and how that works?
Yeah, so essentially right now we're in a kind of trial period where we are mapping out the coast of Finnmark. And this is in cooperation with something called Handelsmiljøfond, which probably has an English name, but I can't think of it right now. It's essentially like a fund. So whenever Norwegian people buy plastic bags, it's like a piece of that price, or like 1 kroner, which is like, I don't know, a tenth of a dollar or something like that. But part of that goes to this fund, and the fund is the intention is to help reduce marine waste or plastic waste in the nature. So every time Norwegians buy plastic bags, the money goes to this fund, and they are the ones funding the operation in Finnmark. And so essentially we are mapping out the entire coast. So the idea now is to cover a lot of area in Finnmark. So we go very fast. We pick like a lot of heavy objects, but we don't do any like detailed cleaning. And the idea is because we want to know where the plastic ends up, so that we know in a year or two like where we need to put effort. Does that make sense? So now we're kind of just like browsing the coast, going really fast, and picking as much as we can. Of course, we want to clean the beaches completely, but we're not picking like microplastics. We're not focusing on that. We're focusing on like total tons. And we're putting everything into a database. And this is happening all over Norway, actually. So this is happening in Finnmark and all the way down to Oslo, so the whole coast. The idea is to know in a few years where plastic accumulates, so we know like where we can put our efforts in the future.
That's so cool. I'm like, that kind of stuff really, really fascinates me, especially because it's like, you're out there, you're kind of boots on the ground, like doing all the cleaning, and then you can see the fruits of your labor when you kind of take a step back and you look at the big picture of the map and the whole database as a whole. So that's really, really awesome. I guess my only or my next question would be, so where does all these where does all this trash go? Like when you collect it and you have it in the containers, like what's kind of the next step typically?
We send it to a recycling factory. It's a bit different in different parts of Norway how they handle it. The issue with marine waste is that it's very often full of salt. And the salt is very hard to recycle because you should ask someone who works with this. But as far as I know, it damages this recycling machine a little bit. So most of the plastic gets burnt, but it gets burnt in, a contained, secure facility, and it gets produced into heating, mostly for Norwegians. So, and these burning facilities, they burn the trash at like 900 degrees, 800, 900 degrees, so really, really high temperatures that make sure, everything is contained. Because, when you burn plastic, a lot of fumes get left out, and also a lot of microplastics. If you burn it just like in your fire, you're going to just have like 1 million pieces of microplastics. So it's very important to have a contained facility that can handle like all the fumes and the microplastic, that can like clean it so it doesn't like end up everywhere. But we try to recycle what we can, and of course anything that is still usable, like for instance these trawl balls that are used for fishing. They are these like floating balls made of plastic, that they use to like mark where they have their nets, for instance. We often find those that are intact, and so we will always give them back to the fishermen, or like offer to give them away. Or if we find some fenders or nets or whatever that can like still be used, we give them back. And I'm very strict. I say, okay, but don't throw it in the ocean because I don't want to pick it up next year. So make sure I give this to you, but make sure you take care of it.
Yeah, that's really cool. And I don't know if you know, but in the U.S., it's really funny because whenever, like all these green energy initiatives come into conversation, or like recycling, or whatever it has to do with like climate related stuff, they always say, oh, well, just like at Norway, and so Norway is always like kind of our leading example of like how to kind of go green, so to speak. And it's really interesting to hear your perspective because you're literally in it, and so you're doing all of the work and kind of putting in all the effort, and so it's really fascinating to see it come to life.
Yeah. I've heard several people say that the Norwegian coastline is kind of known for being very clean and very like pure in a way, but it is one of the most polluted coastlines in the world, and it is because of the Gulf Stream and the industries that are in the North Sea and the Barents Sea, fishing industries. So it's not as clean as it looks like in the pictures, unfortunately.
Yeah. Okay. Well, cool. So then I guess just kind of walk us through like what is like a day in the life for Veronica on I know it's kind of by the season, it's different whether it's the summer or the winter and so forth, but like generally speaking, like how does what keeps you sane, like what's going through your mind, how does your routine work, all that kind of fun stuff?
Yeah, well, it's funny because I feel like I live a fairly normal life in a way. But I guess like everything that you do every day becomes normal, like no matter what it is. But essentially, I work as a skipper for this organization, or I have been for the past 2 years. And I work on a 6 months off, 6 months on kind of shift. So we have very short seasons here where we are able to pick trash. So for the summer, we kind of just work every day, like every weekend, every day, it doesn't matter. And we work very intensely just to get as much done as possible when we can. So it means that in the winter, I have a lot of time off. So in the winter, I go travel, or I sail, or I read a lot. I don't know.
Do you tend to take the winters to go south? Because in the southern hemisphere, the winter is like hotter. So, or do you like to just freeze up in the Arctic Circle?
Well, I definitely like to go south. I do. I have overwintered a few times where I've like stayed for the whole winter. But you don't see the sun between November and February, so it's like completely dark. You can see some northern lights. It's very cold, and a lot of people do leave for the winter actually. So yeah, I really like to travel, and that's also part of why I bought the boat, is because I love traveling. And for me, the winter is just like a perfect time to travel. And I do love the concept of slow traveling. So if I can go away for like a really long period of time and just go to one place and experience that for like a long time instead of like going fast between a lot of places, I would always prefer that. So the winter is just perfect for me because there's not much going on up here anyway. You're kind of stuck in the dark.
So of all the places you've traveled, is it typically by boat specifically? Like, is it mostly in the region that you're at, or have you taken the boat south? Like, I know you could fly south when you dock the boat, but like, have you ever taken the boat around, like on any crazy journeys or anything, or do you typically keep the boat north and then you'll kind of be free to do whatever you want?
Yeah, so because I've been, this boat has only been to Norway, my own boat, but I've used to work as a deckhand on a few different ships. So I've been sailing a lot in like across the Atlantic and down in the Canaries and South America and the west coast of Africa, and just around the South Atlantic Ocean. So that's been really nice. That's a typical winter activity for me. But I usually leave the boat here in Norway, also because I live on board. So and I still want to be here in the Arctic for at least the next few years. I feel like I'm not yet done exploring the Arctic by boat. So I want to have the boat here just because I want to come back in the summer, and it would be a long way to like go back and forth every time. And again, back to like the concept of slow traveling is that if I go somewhere with my boat, for instance, I would like to stay there for quite a while and like experience, and maybe even experience like all 4 seasons in just that one place. So that's I usually keep the boat here, but we'll see. Like maybe in a few years, I will leave Norway and maybe even leave the Arctic and head somewhere. But then that would be like for good, or not for good. That sounded very dramatic, but like for a long for a long time.
Sure. Off to a new horizon, new adventures.
Yeah.
Would you ever like have people on, or do you think having another person on your boat would be advantageous, or would it kind of set you back a little bit? Because I know I believe you said your boat was fairly big for what you use it for. So is that always a hindrance, or do you kind of like to keep your boat as like your private spot?
It is quite a big boat. The issue with my boat is that it only has 2 berths, or like rooms. So essentially I can fit like maybe 3 or 4 people comfortably in the boat. And yeah, it's a bit like what you said. It's my private home, so I do keep it private. But of course, friends and family are welcome to join. And I do enjoy having company on board, especially like good friends that can kind of come. And when I was sailing the Norwegian coast, I treated my boat almost like a hostel that was moving. So I would always have friends on board, like coming and going. It was really nice. I don't think I ever sailed solo for those 3 months for the whole Norwegian coast, because there will always be people, in and out all the time. So that was really nice. And I definitely enjoy having company. I haven't opened my boat to like strangers yet. I know people ask me like every day if they can come on board, but it's always tricky to have people on board as well, because you often have to teach them how everything works and all this, and also because it is your home, so you kind of want to keep your personal life and your public life a bit separate.
Maybe you need to get another boat so that you can use the one as your house and the other one's like an Airbnb for boating. You just take people out to sea or something.
Yeah, second boat. I can already imagine all the work.
Yeah. Well, that's true. Speaking of strangers, like, have you ever had any like sketchy encounters where people, obviously not on your boat, but like I imagine if you dock your boat and you go to get groceries or something, then have you ever had an experience where someone's like trying to mess with your boat while you're gone, or does that not really happen? We have to think of these crazy things in the U.S. because people are nuts over here, but.
Yeah, no, I've never had any experiences like that. I also try to be very careful, especially on what I post in public. So I will never like share my location or anything like that. And I usually, if I share some place I've been, it's always after I've already left that place. So a lot of people see like my stories and they're like, "Oh, you're here," and I'm like, "Actually, I left 2 weeks ago. But I'm just posting it now." So I always try to kind of be careful about what I'm sharing, especially online. But this area is in general like very peaceful, and people really take care of each other. It's also why I really like having the boat here, because people, even if I'm away from the boat, if I'm traveling or something, there's always someone to look after it. The only thing I have experienced is like drunk fishermen showing up in my boat in the middle of the night after they've been to the pub or something. That can sometimes be a little bit uncomfortable, because again, it's your home. Like, can you imagine if someone just like stood in your living room in the middle of the night? You feel a bit invaded in a way. So I've had a few of those encounters. And when I was working close to the Russian border, we would also have like Russian fishermen that would just like come on board and just stood there and speak Russian. I would be like, "Excuse me, can you please leave?" So those are the only encounters, but they're like rather harmless.
That's wild. Now, I guess like the as a side, this just popped into my head. But for internet, do you have like a hotspot or something, or like how does that?
Yeah, I have a hotspot with data, so I'm able to have, as long as I'm in Norway, I'm able to have. I'm able to be online for the most part. It's often a lot of a little bit poor signals because you're quite far away from settlements or anything. But I would say in general it's pretty good, and I have also a Wi-Fi antenna on board, so I can take in Wi-Fi from other places. If I'm in the city, for instance, I can like take in their Wi-Fi. Yeah.
Nice. Okay, sweet. Yeah, I was just curious. Now the other kind of danger. So there was like the people danger, which doesn't seem to be an issue. Now, what about Mother Nature danger, where it's like if you're at it? This has always been my like. I'm not in any way a sailor. I've never even really done any kind of long-term time on a boat. But like when you're out at sea, I'm assuming like deep sea, and there's like these 20, 30 foot waves. Like, how does it not like knock your boat over? Like, what do you, I don't know, this is just my ignorance, but like, how do you like, are you supposed to deal with that on a boat?
Yeah, I think it's funny because a lot of people who maybe haven't been at sea so much, they always fear like the open ocean, like what you say, like the deep sea and everything. But I always feel like that's the safest spot to be.
Really?
Because there's nothing to hit. There's no like local wind variations. There's no like currents or waves that are breaking usually. So the closer you get to the shore, that's kind of where it starts to get dangerous, because if you lose control, you risk like being shoved into a mountain, or you will have these strange currents. You will have really strange winds coming from the land. So the open ocean to me is like, oh, finally I can breathe out and just be out here. Because sailboats are built with this long keel that I mentioned earlier. So you will have like a really, really heavy, usually lead or steel keel on the boat. And that's essentially what's like keeping the boat stable. So it depends a little bit on from sailboat to sailboat. But my boat is built so that the mast can actually be 10 degrees below the waterline, and the boat is still going to straighten up. So you would have to be very unlucky to actually flip the boat over. Maybe if you had like two really big waves that are crashing on top of you, maybe it could happen. But in general, you don't really hear that much about sailboats flipping so much.
Oh, well, that's good.
It's a difference, for instance, for catamaran, it's a bit different, and some boats are also built a bit different. But in general, these are really good for like high latitude sailing, where it becomes, it can be like hurricanes or at least heavy gales out there.
Okay, well that's good. Keeping you somewhat safe here. Now, is there like a particular place that you've gone anywhere that stands out in your mind as like one of the most like remote or picturesque, or any place that you really find a lot of joy in having gone there, whether it's the adventure of getting there or whether it's the place itself? Like, I know you've posted a couple pictures of like some abandoned lighthouses and things like that, which I thought were cool, but I'm just curious in your own perspective, like what you think has been kind of the most fulfilling, most fruitful experience so far.
Yeah, it's hard to say because there's so many. I think up here definitely Svalbard is very high on the list. Svalbard is a very remote island, very close to the North Pole, and it's like a high Arctic area. with polar bears, and you have to carry a rifle everywhere you go because of the polar bears. It's actually mandatory to carry a rifle.
Really?
The only place in the world where you can get a fine for not carrying guns. so
Wow, that's crazy.
so that's definitely a very interesting place. And northern Norway and Norway in general is I mean, I might be a bit biased, but it is one of my favorite places to sail. And of course, first time I crossed the Atlantic was a really big experience. Just the feeling of being out at sea for that long, and we spent 23 days crossing. So it's just this. You really get a feeling of how big the ocean is, and the Atlantic isn't even a very big ocean. I mean, you have the Pacific, and so the Pacific is also on the list. But yeah, I think the feeling of just seeing how large, or getting that feeling of how large the ocean is, and also crossing between continents. We left Africa, and then you just look at the ocean for 23 days, and then suddenly you're in South America, and it is a very strange feeling. So that would also be like one of my favorite experiences.
Yeah, sure. And now when you do something like that, again, this is just my ignorance, I guess, but how do you, because it's so long, you said that was a couple weeks, so like how do you prepare in terms of like how much food you have on board, or like, because obviously you can't just go to the grocery store, you're in the middle of the ocean. So do you rely a lot on fishing, or is there just like some like non-perishable stuff that you have, or like what kind of goes into the preparation for like a transatlantic voyage like that?
Yeah, you need to make sure you have enough wine. That's the most important. And of course, a lot of canned food, and like food that can last for a while. And then it's usually like the first week you will have the best meals because you will eat everything that is like fresh, and you will have vegetables. And then as the further you go, the worse or the lower quality your meals become. I don't have a freezer on board, so I can't use a freezer. In the winter, the whole boat becomes a freezer, so that's kind of convenient. At the time when I sailed across the Atlantic, I was working on a really big ship. It was a 3-masted schooner, so we were like 30 people on board. So it was a lot of room to like stock up on food. We needed a lot of food as well, but yeah, we could have enough room for food. But otherwise, I when I sail in Norway as well, I don't really visit shops that much. I try to always anchor up somewhere. I always prefer anchoring. So it would maybe be like 3 or 4 weeks between each time I actually go to a grocery store. So I do rely a lot on fishing. And yeah, food that like holds like dried food. And I also usually dry my own food sometimes. So yeah, there are many solutions to it.
Do you have a particular fish that you, or seafood in general that you like? My favorite's lobster, personally. But
I love all kinds of seafood. I really do. We get a lot of codfish up here, so you have to get really creative with your codfish and just make a lot of variants of codfish. And halibut is also something that we get a lot, which is definitely one of my favorites.
Sure. Cool. Now, when you were first thinking of doing all this, like, did you have any inspiration from like previous, like was polar exploration, or like any of the kind of the people from history, did that play a part at all, or have you, is it always just kind of like an innate thing where like, you said your parents taught you a lot, so like were you more inspired by like people from history, or was it just something that like you grew up with, so you knew like you grew up seeing all the beauty of the ocean and sailing and all that?
Yeah, so I grew up in Norway, and in Norway we have a lot of these polar explorers that we are very proud of. We have Roald Amundsen, who was the first person to go to Antarctica, or the center of Antarctica, and we have Fridtjof Nansen, who skied across Greenland, or the first Westerner to ski across Greenland. Of course, Greenland was already populated by Inuits, so it's kind of a imperialistic way of seeing
Yeah.
things, but Norwegians are very proud of it nonetheless. So definitely, I grew up like reading tales about especially Roald Amundsen and a lot of these like Norwegian polar explorers. A lot of them were men. We do have like a few female polar explorers as well, but the most famous ones are men from that time. So at least at the time of when I was younger, I was really inspired by these Norwegians. Yeah, and then in later times, it's become. I mean, now we have to see it maybe from a modern eye, or maybe we view it in a more modern eye, and yeah, you know you can discuss the imperialistic tendencies of these explorers, but they did have some really impressive explorations, at least. But we have to give them credit for that.
I mean, something that I find really fascinating about Amundsen, or at least the explorers of that time, was you saw there was kind of this dynamic where there were three moving parts. There was the one which was like the research. So a lot of people went on these voyages to collect specimens and to do like research in that sense. You also had the explorers, who were like these adventure seeking, adrenaline junkie people like Amundsen and a lot of these other folks. And then you had the third one, which was the imperialist, who's like the guy who wanted to stake the flag in the ground and say, you know, I put the US flag, or I put the Norwegian flag, or whatever it was. So you had these three like very different personalities, at least in like the books that I've read. And it is really fascinating how it's like there was that imperialist side, which by modern eyes doesn't, you know, there's a lot of issue with that. But I think when you kind of interpret history in the context by which it happened, it really is fascinating, like what they went through. And you might have heard of like the book Endurance with Shackleton's boat and all that. And then I read a book about Amundsen's journey in Antarctica, where they got stuck and they had to do the overwintering, or I don't know if that's the right term, but they had to like stay there throughout the winter. And it's very hard to conceptualize, I think, by modern eyes. So that's why I think it's really cool that for you to be going, like living on the boat full time, and like you're kind of experiencing that to an extent. Like you're not fearing for your life, obviously, but like there is an extent of like that adventurous spirit. Like you just want to kind of get out there and see what the world has to offer, because it's a big world, it's a big ocean. There's a lot of really, really interesting stuff out there, you know? So yeah, it's just really, it's really inspiring to see, to hear what you're doing. You're kind of planting your own flag in a way, because you're like doing this in what I presume to be a fairly male dominated industry. So you're kind of staking your claim there in that sense too, you know?
Yeah, absolutely. You're actually sitting on the South Pole book by Roald Amundsen at the moment. It was the thickest book that I could find, so I'm using it as a tripod, actually. So yeah, I absolutely think, and you mentioned Shackleton. I think Shackleton has been the inspiration for quite a lot of sailors, and especially the high latitude sailors. They always mention Shackleton because he was such an excellent captain, an excellent navigator, and it really shows in the books as well, like how skilled he was. And I think the same with Amundsen is these people had to be very calculated and smart in order to do this. It wasn't just like sheer luck or like just adrenaline junkies with a lot of luck. They had to really plan out and in order to make these trips successful. So I think they are very impressive and they are really fascinating to read, and they were definitely an inspiration for me when I started. And some of the female explorers as well that we have here in Norway. A great one for me was Cecilie Skog at the time. She was she's more of a modern explorer, but she was the first, at least Norwegian woman to visit all like 7 summits and do all these. And visit the North Pole and the South Pole and everything. So I think it's in Norway we do very highly value these polar explorers, and I think that's also a source of inspiration for a lot of people.
Yeah, I think there's definitely been a more recent push by female explorers as I don't know, the last 50 or so years, and it is really exciting. Like I think the first. I could be wrong. I could be wrong about this, but I think the first person to ski across Antarctica was a woman. And so like there's a lot of just really exciting stuff. And there's another woman still alive, still, breaking all sorts of records, but she summited K2, summited Everest, went to space, went to Antarctica. Like it's really, it's a fascinating time in history because it gives everyone, like, there's really not that many barriers now. Like everyone is kind of like, all right, let's be a team. Let's do this. Like, let's all kind of work together. But in any event, it is just a wild time in history. So I'm a big fan of quotes from people throughout history. And so one thing I think I'll leave this on is a quote from Teddy Roosevelt where he said, do what you can with what you have where you are. And I think you kind of embody that because you've been living on your own, learning how to be very like this kind of independent adventurers, explorer spirit. You're doing a lot for the world. You're being part of the solution, not the problem. I hope you keep it up. I think it's really inspiring, and I'm just happy we had this opportunity to have this conversation. So thanks so much for coming on the show.
Thank you. I'm really glad to hear. It was really fun talking to you.
Yeah, of course. All right. Thanks, everyone. Take care.